Hi, my name is Kara Powell, and I work with the wonderful team at the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm a faculty member at Fuller Seminary. I'm sitting in my office here in Pasadena, California. I could say that these books are fake just to make me look smart and more academic, but they're actually real, although don't quiz me on them, because for many of them, it's been quite a while since I read them. I am so glad that we're going to have this conversation today with my friend Dan Kimball. I've known Dan for, gosh, probably about 13, 14 years. And every time I'm around him, I learn from him, I take notes, and I am poised here with a pen and pencil ready to take notes, as I hope you are too. The reason that we wanted to do this today is this is a day that we are very excited about at the Fuller Youth Institute. For some of you, April 15th is kind of a disappointing day. For me, it's actually the anniversary of the day my husband and I met. So it's a highlight for us. Dave and I already wished each other happy anniversary in a very romantic kind of way this morning. But we're releasing Can I Ask That Volume 2 today on April 15th. Can I Ask That Volume 1 came out about a year ago, and it was 8 questions designed to help leaders help students ask tough questions. One of the major findings of our Sticky Faith research has been how important it is for young people to express their doubts, to ask their tough questions. You know, young people are going to ask tough questions about life and God, with or without us. I don't know about you, but I want it to be with us. And so that's why we've released both Can I Ask That Volume 1 last year and Can I Ask That Volume 2 today. Some of the questions that are in Can I Ask That Volume 2 that you can explore with students are, is hell wrong? Why do bad things happen to good people? And why is it such a big deal to have sex outside of marriage? That's just a smattering of the questions available in Can I Ask That Too. We've been having an exciting contest, a pre-release contest where folks have been tweeting in the tough questions that young people ask them, and we will announce the winners at the very end of our webcast today. If you want to follow along and chime into the conversation, we'd love for you to tweet in using the hashtag Can I Ask That? Can I Ask That, one word. And the reason that we wanted to talk to Dan Kimball is Dan is really growing in amazing insight and expertise when it comes to helping young people wrestle with questions. As I mentioned, Dan and I have known each other for 13, 14 years. We've been on boards together. We've spoken at conferences together. One time we ended up in the TSA security line at the San Jose airport near where Dan lives together. So I remember we're trying to have this conversation, and this is in the era before TSA pre-check. So I'm taking off my shoes and Dan's taking off his shoes as we're making our way through the security line. But I just love Dan's passion for Jesus, his passion for young people, and how Dan is always willing to take a group to a deeper level. That's a big part of what Dan does as the teaching pastor at Vintage Faith Church. And Dan's also the director of the Regeneration Project at Western Seminary. He's the author of a number of books, including Adventure in Churchland, They Like Jesus But Not the Church, and a book that he's working on even this week with the title Crazy Bible that we're going to talk to Dan a little bit about toward the end of this webcast. So Dan, thanks for carving time out of what I know is a week where you're very focused on writing to help us think about the role of tough questions in young people's faith formation.
Yeah, well, I can't anything more important almost to be talking about. So that's why I am thrilled with what you're doing and the first book as well. Totally.
Well, great, Dan. Thanks for being such a good friend of the Fuller Youth Institute. Now, Dan, you're kind of in the middle of a ministry role shift. You have been a senior pastor, and now you're moving a little bit more, it seems, back into youth and college ministry. What's behind that shift? What's motivating it?
Yeah, I was a youth pastor at Santa Cruz Bible Church for, I think, 7, 8 years, and then out of need, started at the same place. And then after a couple of years of that, we ended up planting a church and Vintage Faith Church in Santa Cruz.
Great name, by the way. I love that name, Vintage Faith Church.
That came from working with college students saying they wanted to go back to, like, not organized Christianity, and so coming up, and that's where we ended up naming the church. But it probably for me, I don't know if I ever left youth ministry like in my heart, so to speak. Sounds corny, but I got caught up for so many years just in the church itself. And we're at our 10th year as a church. We have 4 worship gatherings on a Sunday. It's a thrill. But the past several years, I just keep thinking like again and again and again about teenagers, college age, and probably mainly, I think it's the need, not the kind of like almost the desperation of like, we got to do something. And I'm so energized being around youth leaders too, and learning from youth leaders. So we announced to our church that I'm going to shift my role to focus back on youth and college, and then work with the staff and the interns, and really spend a bulk of my time there.
That's awesome. Well, I'm thrilled that you're going to be able to devote even more energy to youth and emerging adults, college students. Now, as I've spent time with you, I know that you're someone who loves having conversations with people, one-on-one, small groups. You're a great question asker, and you're also a great listener. So as you've spent time with especially teenagers and young adults or emerging adults, what are some of the recurring themes you've heard in their questions about faith or life overall? That's part one of the question. And then part two is, how have you tried to respond to what you're hearing from young people?
Yeah, I'd say when we first even met 13 years ago, whatever it was, I think I'm always a question asker. It's mainly because I like learning from people. And so even with youth ministry back then and college ministry, but the questions that were coming up about faith seemed more about impressions of Christianity and church, like about not liking music and not liking the style of the preaching and how you define community. And to me, what has shifted is asking questions now more about, it's not like, is the resurrection true? The questions are coming up much more exactly like you're asking. And I think my nature is just constantly writing things down. And everywhere I go, I just grab some of these because I'm using these here. Like, I just survey teenagers and college age, anywhere I speak, anything I'm doing. And you're just hearing questions like about Old Testament violence and so many things from like 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds. And so I think it's just the nature is changed, which is also really of the questions are now being more exactly, again, that's why I am such a fan. I have this here of what you're doing, because I think you're addressing the same questions, exactly what's being asked today.
Great. Now, when a young person comes to you, let's say one-on-one or even in a small group or maybe in a youth group and asks the question that you just raised about, say, violence in the Old Testament, or maybe even something that's a little bit more ongoing culturally, like, something about same-sex marriage or whatever it might be. How do you try to respond in that moment when they're asking that tough question? Because I know we'd love to learn from the principles or best practices that you found helpful. So when that young person is really wrestling with something, how do you respond, and how do you want us as youth leaders to respond?
Well, I think the biggest thing to start is creating a culture in your church, or if you're a parent with your children, about making questions a good thing. Is that I think there has been a subtle, I wouldn't say fear, but not a culture necessarily in churches to even encourage questions. So I think it's very important to constantly be just teaching, ask any question. Questions are good, because teenagers are hitting, when you read Fowler's Stages of Faith, they're hitting this time period in life when they're going to be asking questions about their belief system. And it's really horrifying if we don't create cultures that aren't encouraging questions. So I think the biggest thing is to constantly be making sure that you are creating a culture of ask any question. If you have a question that you may even think is a bad question, God's not against question asking. I think that's really the strongest thing we should do first. And that comes from saying it up front as you teach. I would say, I did this back in high school ministry. Every single year, I would take two different groups, and one were actually a Christian group and was non-Christian group. And I'd ask them, what would you like to even see taught on? And so we'd buy pizzas, we'd have like a couple hours together, and I'd let them help discuss what they want to learn about, what are their big questions, and then ask them why. And every year, even in our church today, I'd be encouraging to do surveys of your church and of the youth group and saying, like, what questions do you have? Write them down anonymously, because I think the feedback we get will then really help us understand that. But we got to create a culture where when they have doubts and questions, that you encourage them to not keep it quiet.
That's great, Dan. I was in Orlando yesterday and met a youth leader who, she and her husband lead the youth ministry together. And part of what they do, I think about every month, is they just have a section of time in the youth ministry that they call Ask Anything. And just like you're saying, they give out index cards and let the young people, let their students write down questions. And it helps them stay in touch with the most pressing needs of their kids. And it can become the structure for ongoing teaching, and that can frame the next several weeks of communication and teaching that they're doing. One of the things we've seen in our sticky faith research is how important it is to even give children an opportunity to express and explore their questions. A lot of times, part of why teenagers are hesitant to raise questions about suffering and the existence of God or the existence of hell, I mean, really tough stuff, is because they learned lessons when they were in children's Sunday school. No, we don't ask questions like that about God here, kind of response that they heard as third graders, fourth graders. And so unfortunately, we in youth ministry, we then inherit the ugliness of that. So, I just want to say to anybody who's working with children, and especially those of you who are working with middle schoolers, my kids are 14 and 12, my oldest too, and they're asking a lot of tough questions about God. So it's never too early to let kids know that they can ask questions about God. Now, Dan, thinking about questions along different phases, let's fast forward a little bit, because you've also worked quite a bit with adults. Are there any differences in the kind of questions that you see teenagers or college students ask versus the kind of questions that adults are asking?
I mean, I think what I think's been going on is there has been a lot of younger adults are exiting faith, and as you know, and some of it I do believe is the context of their church, but a lot of them are. But I spent like 3.5 hours with a university student a couple weeks ago, and it was all about that he couldn't get answers to these questions that he was taught as a kid, right? Mm-hmm. And then the adults weren't there. So I think the questions were more intelligent. They weren't just more about maybe the questions about why can't I do this, maybe in the younger years. Then you're hearing more questions about, here's one from a 14-year-old. I just was scanning these right before I talked. 14 years old. Is homosexuality a sin, or is it contextual, like tattoos, pork, or women speaking in the church, right? 14 years old.
Was that pork that you said? Contextual, yeah, like pork?
Tattoos, pork, or women speaking in the church. I think, and what I think has been happening, and this is, I think I'm answering your question, because during the adult years, it starts going to not just, am I fitting in with the rules or the morals? I think it then comes to, how can I actually believe these things? And then it goes more into, if God, why about the alleged genocide questions and questions about slavery. And I think those kind of questions start coming more in the college years, maybe more so than younger, but the internet's changing everything. I had a junior hire this was back in 2006, when I can distinctly remember this. I was getting emails about questions from Leviticus and these very detailed questions. And I answered some by email and finally said, let's meet up. And when he came up to me, I never thought to ask him his age. He was an 8th grader. And he was going online, and he found a website called evilbible.com. And he was pulling, questions right off there and then copying and sending them to me. And so I'm just like, yikes, and realize that it's a different world out there, because there's so much information out there that can confuse kids. and the parents are getting blown away. I will say what I've heard multiple times from the adults that I'm talking to. They're saying their parents couldn't answer the questions. Even their youth pastors were stumped. And then it started rocking then their whole trust and confidence in the faith of their family and even youth pastors. So that's why I do believe we don't have to have all the answers, but we have to be creating cultures of just training. You may not know the answer, but then you can walk someone through and you can study it together. But I've heard that multiple times now, that they lose confidence in their faith when their parents and the youth pastors don't know how to answer, or they give really cheapened answers, like, well, in heaven one day we'll know, which is true about stuff.
Right. Now, I think you've raised a really important point, Dan, that a lot of times kids' questions stump us. And I've had adults tell me, I'm afraid that if I create a culture where kids ask a tough question, then I'm going to be caught flat-footed and I'm not going to know what to do. So, what do you do, Dan, when, you say you spent 3.5 hours with a college student? What do you do when that student, or when a teenager or young adult asks you a tough question that you don't have a good answer to?
I try to, I always also like saying, like, I try to find responses sometimes versus answers, because there are, I can't, some of the questions are tough to have a distinct answer to, but you can walk through, just like I've given out some books, but you have to be careful what books you give out, because some of the books written by Christians are I got one back, and it was from another college-age girl that said, I felt stupid in reading this book, how he made me feel for being an atheist. And then I didn't even think about that. A lot of the language can be demeaning, that we will say, like, of course you should believe this. You're dumb if you're not believing this. And this goes back to our first question of children and youth, making sure that we're doing that. But I just think we have to do our best to look things up. And then if you're working with individuals, show them how you're studying it. There's so many books out there. And that's why, again, you didn't ask me to do this, but I'm just like, this book and the one and number 2 that's coming out, I can't recommend them enough to start walking through, because you give just enough info in here to have some rational ways of addressing the toughest questions that are being asked.
Well, thanks, Dan. And part of why we wrote the book, and I think it's what you're saying too, is that when a student does ask us a tough question, we can then study up with the student. We can invite the student into our process and say, wow, I don't know. That's a great question. Let's figure it out together. And it gives us an ongoing opportunity for conversation instead of just an answer that truncates the student's quest. Now, speaking of books, you are spending a lot of time this week, and I know this spring and summer, working on a new book with the title Crazy Bible. That's just an awesome title. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write that book and what it's about?
It's exactly what we're talking about, but it's for, I've heard there's kind of a mantra that's going on out there, and it says the fastest way to get a Christian to become an atheist is to have them read their Bibles. And it's sort of what's going on is that there's so many Christians are being caught off guard with the stuff that's on the internet, especially because the focus is all on it's almost the same thing that they're picking and choosing all the worst parts of the Bible to bring attention to. And then the Christians have mainly only talked about the nice parts of the Bible. So basically I'm pulling out some of the most commonly pointed out things that cause confusion, and it is violence in the Old Testament, the women, women issue and leadership and all kinds of things like that. So I'm hitting these. The how do you read Leviticus? Because that's so often mocked from and used in little graphics online and all of that. This is something else I think is important for teenagers and adults, is realizing, I think what's different than 15 years ago is there's now community that they're finding as teenagers and college, or as they're doubting and questioning, which again is good, but then they find community which gives with other doubters, or they're now coming out as atheists, And so then they're finding comfort online with other people who have gone through the same thing. Almost every one of the people that I've talked to have shared that similar experience of realizing they're not alone. Then when they find others, it gives them more confidence to basically bag their faith and say, I can't believe this anymore. But you said something I think is very important. It starts really in children, and even going back to, I don't think we should talk about, the horrors of genocide in the Old Testament with, fifth graders necessarily, but start teaching how do you ask questions. And one more thing is that I think also how a youth pastor or someone teaches, we can be modeling how we get to the answers we do. Because I think we have taught so often, like, here's the facts that we're trying to teach, but why not walk them through, kind of like Bible hermeneutics, so they understand how you got to where you are, which then helps them address all kinds of questions later, because so many of them is a matter of hermeneutics, really, that they just have never looked into some of these things. But I think we should shift our teaching to go a little bit more into how do we come up with the answers that we have while we teach all the time.
Oh, that's really good, Dan. Super practical. I mean, we can start doing that this week as we're teaching high school and middle school students. I love that. One of the phrases that we say at FYI some is show your work. As parents or leaders, show others our process. So that's fantastic. One last question before we let you go. You're clearly advocating, as are we, that churches should be a safe place and ministry should be a safe place for young people to authentically ask whatever they're wrestling with. But I have also heard from adults that they're afraid that, gosh, if young people feel like they can wrestle with big questions, then that might open up doors that actually lead them away from God. So the very wrestling with questions might be something that draws them away from faith. As you've spent, hundreds of hours with college students and teenagers, how would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think we should be afraid. If God's God and the Bible's true, we shouldn't be afraid that the truth won't stand out. I do think we have to be careful that we don't, if we're presenting, that we then have the responsibility of making sure we can show them some responses to the questions so they're not just hanging out there. But I think we should be teaching, I think we should be proactively teaching things that they will wrestle with, even if they don't know they're going to wrestle with them yet. Because what I wish, this is what I spoke about at Youth Specialties last year, was there's some questions that I wish I would have proactively brought down to a teenage level and taught then. And they may not even have those questions yet, but they will later. And I think we should be doing this earlier. And that's why I think the two books that you've written are perfect ways to walk through these questions in advance. And again, I'm not saying, I've mentioned your book so many times, I'm doing this because I really believe in it. So that's why I'm mentioning it so often. It's really rare. I don't think there's anything else like it out there.
Well, thank you, Dan. So this book that we authored that Dan has mentioned just a few times is available at stickyfaith.org, as well as there's several hundred free resources available at stickyfaith.org on this and other topics. We also are ready to announce the winners of our Tweet In Your Tough Question That You Hear from Students contest. And excuse me if I mispronounce the names, but it's Amanda Mackey and Kurt Heineman. You're winning a free bundle of Can I Ask That resources that we will be sending your way. So Dan, I just want to thank you so much for being on the cutting edge of especially young adult and teenage high school ministry and helping all of us be comfortable with some of these tough and often uncomfortable questions. So thanks for the great work that you're doing.
And thank you. You're a hero to me. I love what you're doing, and I've always admired what you're doing, and it's so needed. I think that's why I'm back focusing more on youth ministry, because I really believe the church needs to really focus on youth more than maybe we ever have before. So I thank you for everything you're doing.
Great words to end on. Thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for watching.